Welcome to a special extended edition of the Yes to Life show with me, Robin Daly, founder of Yes to Life, the UK's integrative cancer care charity. Today, it's my absolute pleasure and honour to introduce you to no less than 6 key pioneers from the beginnings of integrative medicine for cancer, all people who have dedicatedly built the ground that we're standing on today. The show is bringing together Dr. Bernie Siegel, Ian Gawler, Ralph Moss, Dr. Keith Block, Michael Lerner and Patria King to share their combined wisdom regarding questions addressed to them by current practitioners of integrative oncology. Our 6 pioneers join us from the USA and Australia. Huge welcome to you all, and thank you so much for making the time to come together in this way at all hours of the day and night. Welcome Michael Lerner from the farther reaches of the west coast of the US. Michael is a man who's spent a lifetime working tirelessly to change the face of oncology. Welcome to Dr. Bernie Siegel, pioneer of mind-body medicine, talking to us, I think, from the US East Coast. Also from the East Side, a big welcome to the legendary author and researcher Dr. Ralph Moss. From further north, Chicago, we have the doctor who is justifiably referred to as the father of integrative oncology, Dr. Keith Block. And then, from the far side, in Australia, I'd like to welcome Dr. Ian Gawler, who has done so much since those early years to broaden up ideas on what could help those with cancer. And last, but by no means least, also in Australia, we have the inspirational Patria King, a beacon of light to people with cancer for more than 4 decades. As I said in my introduction, you all qualify as heroes of mine, respected names from the dawning of my consciousness around oncology, people who were talking sense long before the rest of us had caught up. I never dreamt I'd even get to meet you all, let alone have the privilege of gathering you together for this super panel. So I have a bunch of questions for you all that have come from current practitioners, supporters of Yes to Life, in fact, all of whom have you to thank for the ground they are standing on now. Our first question is from Dr. Penny Kekayoglu, Senior NHS Oncologist and also co-chair of the British Society for Integrative Oncology. She writes, I am a mainstream clinician and chose to train in integrative and functional medicine to understand and offer a personalised approach to cancer care. Isn't it time that integrative medicine became mainstream, and what needs to change? So any of you could weigh in on that, I think. Maybe, Michael, why don't you start in there?
Well, first of all, thank you, Robin, for assembling us. And all of the folks here are old friends, and I'm so honored to be with you all. As you know, I've worked on these questions of integrative oncology for 40 years. And I really I believe, in response to your colleague's question, that integrative oncology, or what Wayne Jonas calls whole person oncology, is really ready to take the next step. I really believe that. And I really believe it is ready to move toward being standard of care. And I think this is in the face of many, many vast financial and political forces that are, for very good reasons, completely committed to the status quo. Now, it's different in the UK, where the financial incentives are different, and perhaps in Australia as well. But in the United States, I can simply say that there are simply immense forces, largely big pharma, that almost control the system. And I don't say that as an accusation for big pharma. As long as medicine and pharmacology are for-profit institutions, that's how it's going to work. Those are where the forces are. Some of us believe that really medicine and pharmacology should be outside of the market system. But as long as they're part of the market system, those forces will be arrayed. But we know from experience that, for example, when women began to demand a better approach to birth, or when women began to demand a more integrative approach to breast cancer, that because women are market forces with a stronger interest in integrative approaches, the demand side can make a difference. And I think I just recently did a conversation that it will be up on the cancerchoices.org website with Wayne Jonas, MD, who was the head of the first National Institutes of Health Center for Complementary Medicine, and very distinguished VA physician. And what I really grasped in a strange, fresh way for the first time this past month is that for 40 years, I have been understating the limitations of conventional therapies, and I have been understating the impact of whole person therapies. I'm a very careful person. I'm a very evidence-based person. And cancerchoices.org and my original MIT Press book, Choices in Healing, both focused on, the case for it. But even spending 40 years on it, I just hadn't fully recognized that, you know what, from an oncologist's point of view, they know the limits of conventional therapies, but it typically doesn't get conveyed to the patient in terms of what those limitations are. And then if you go to whole person integrative care stuff, it actually can deliver better quality of life, longer life, less chance of recurrence, and all these things. So I have a kind of after 40 years of work on this, I have a fresh appreciation, and then I'm going to bring this to an end, that the limitations of conventional oncology, which I believe in where it's useful, and the force of whole person practices should bring us to a new recognition that this should be the standard of care. I won't say it will be easy, but I will say the evidence is there, and it should become the standard of care.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mark. Yes. Yeah, Bernie. Yes, please do.
I learned this in a sense, in a shocking way. I asked 100 medical students to draw themselves working as a doctor. Only one drawing had a patient in it. Okay? And that's something we need to incorporate. Now, the same is true when you say to a patient, draw yourself receiving chemotherapy. One drew the devil giving him poison. Okay? Another may literally drew God as the source of chemo. Who has no side effects? The person who's receiving treatment from God. And that's why physicians have to learn to treat people, not just the disease. And then you have a very different response. So, yeah, in my office, everybody got a box of crayons and was told, draw yourself, your disease, your treatment, your immune system, all those things. And then I could guide them and help them to make choices. And it could be anything in their life. Draw yourself at work. We have more deaths, illnesses on Monday morning. So if you hate your life and then you get cancer, guess who's more likely to die than the person who loves what they're doing or quits? That's the other thing I saw so much of. How many people quit what they were doing and, I'm going to be dead in a few months, then I'm moving. I'm getting a new job. I'm quitting the law office and playing the violin. I'm going to the mountains to live. And when I wasn't called to funerals, I'd call up and say, why didn't you invite me? And the person who I thought was dead answered the phone and said, I didn't die. That's why he didn't get invited. Because they were living a different life and the body got the message. And we're all going to die, but living is the important part. And the other is, it's easy to tell what people need help with when you say to somebody, give me a word that describes what it's like to have cancer. Failure. I said, how does that fit your life? She said, well, my body failed me. I said, that is not my question. How does failure fit your life? Oh, my parents committed suicide when I was a child. I must have been a failure as a child. So, you know, and I don't make up any of these stories. But again, when you listen to a word like pressure, the failure, you eliminate those things in their life, their body responds also. And the other is, whenever I read medical journals, why do women live longer than men with the same cancers? Why? Because sitting in your office, what does the guy say? I can't work anymore. What's the point of living? I said, turn your head to the left. You got a wife and 3 kids. And what do the women say? And I don't make up any of these stories. I have 6 kids. I can't die till they're all married and out of the house. 20 years later, her 6th child, the daughter, married, and her cancer came back and she died. So, you know, we can't separate people's lives from their outcomes. I mean, as I say, we're all going to die, but help them to live. And what a message their body gets that it didn't get before.
Right. Thanks very much, Bertie. Ralph.
I wanted to jump in and say and second what Michael Lerner was saying. Michael and I have been friends and colleagues for almost from the start, from the 80s, and I think, you know, our thinking is along parallel tracks. But it's interesting because we never talked about this issue that he just brought up. And my last book, Cancer Incorporated, which is at my website, mossreport.com, goes into considerable detail on the monetary payments from the drug industry to the oncologists, and especially what I focused on. And I just want to say that this data is hiding in plain sight because part of Obamacare was an act passed in Congress, bipartisan. Tom Harkin, and was a Democrat, and I forget who the other one was, who was a leading Republican at the time. Both sponsored this legislation to require the drug companies to report to the penny how much money they were giving to American doctors. And it's phenomenal. You have to look at this. Everybody has to look at this. As I say, hiding in plain sight, because some American oncologists are getting up to $3 million a year from individual drug companies, for basically promoting their products. And people will say, the immediate response would be, well, the way the system is set up, they have to take that money because how else would they do their research? But what we're talking about here is money that goes into the pockets of the individuals. We're not talking about research funds. We're talking about funds that are given for amorphous services that these doctors provide to the various drug and, you know, other medical related companies. And this came to a head about 3 or 4 years ago when the physician-in-chief at my former institution, Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, Jose Baselga, was exposed on the front page of the New York Times for taking $3 million from a drug company, and he was promoting their product so heavily that it raised suspicions at the Times and at ProPublica, which is a kind of public interest research group. Why is this guy pushing drugs that even the company itself, he didn't coordinate his statements with the company. The company pulled the drug from development, and he hadn't gotten the memo, literally, and he was going on like Marie Antoinette after her head got cut off. He was still going on promoting this drug with outrageous statements. And my former department at Memorial Sloan Kettering, Public Affairs, was putting out press releases with his handsome face on it, on the press release, about the wonders of this drug that was behaved so poorly in clinical trials that they pulled the drug. The point being, though, I'm not going after, so to speak, the rank and file of the 25,000 or so oncologists in America. I think they have a huge problem. And this goes back to what Michael was saying. And the problem is, to put it, in very forthright terms, it's a problem of corruption. That the leadership of the field of oncology, as embodied in ASCO, American Society for Clinical Oncology, has been corrupted by Big Pharma. And the vehicle, the mechanism of that corruption is, first of all, to provide much of the research funds, the researchers who sit on, the panel of doctors who are evaluating the results. But you have a situation where if you're accused of a crime in the United States, in most, I would imagine, many jurisdictions, you have to sit on a jury or you're a judge, you're going to be examined very closely to make sure you don't have a conflict of interest. As I was writing my book, I went through this process when I was living in Maine, and it was almost comical because we spent an entire day going into the minutiae of the lives of all the jurors to make sure there was no possible conflict. One woman was rejected from the panel because she had babysat for one of the defendants 25 years before, so they bumped her off the panel. But in America, and maybe in other countries as well, you can be the evaluator of a lead author on a clinical trial of a drug, not a legal trial, but something of even as much, if not greater, consequence for society. You can be the judge and the jury of a new drug and be taking money into your pocket from the same company that's proposing the drug. That's corruption. Nobody seems to care or know or do anything. I mean, yes, it made a splash in the New York Times for, 3 or 4 years ago. The person who wrote those articles moved on to some other thing. They've never touched it again. Now, I never hear reference to it anywhere, and nobody seems to, find this to be abnormal. But this is a mechanism, not the only one.
Let me interrupt a minute. Part of it is that you become doctors for the wrong reasons. And you want to impress people, say, with your money and everything else. I mean, one of the things I mentioned to medical schools, which nobody has done, I said, when people apply, tell them, draw yourself working as a doctor and send it with the application. So these are people treating a diagnosis and a disease, not a human being. And they want to impress everybody. I always say Donald Trump is an example of what kind of life he lived to make his parents happy and what money it means. And so when you become that doctor, my son, the doctor, you're a doctor for the wrong reasons. And it's something, again, why I say you have to know the people, both the doctors and the patients. And the placebo effect. I mean, what you tell people, this is a fatal illness, you're going to die. There are people who have gone home and died. I don't mind what I call lying to people, to give them hope. Yeah, because they're not a statistic. So, I mean, they got to tell you one, because this is the landscape gardener who had developed cancer. I operated, he had cancer of the stomach. He received chemo. I said, you need more treatment? No. It's springtime. Gonna go home, make the world beautiful. So when I die, I leave a beautiful world. Those are his exact words. And 6 years later, the nurse handed me his chart. I said, he's dead. we have two people with the same name. She said, open the door. And I opened the door to the examining room, and there sat John. Hi, I have a hernia from lifting boulders in my landscape business. He became my teacher and my therapist. He lived, I think, to 70 or 90 or something. I went to his 70th wedding anniversary. But you see, we should be learning from those patients. Why didn't you die when you were supposed to? And they always have a story to tell you. And so I taught people, as I say, not how to not die, but how to enjoy living. And a lot of lovely and wonderful things happen. And then there are the others whose hope is taken away, and it affects your immune function and everything else, and boom, you lie down and die. We need to treat people.
Well, I think that's what Dr. Kekeagulu is interested in. She's definitely heading in that direction, and she's a pioneer oncologist in this country, the lady who asked the questions. And thanks for the very concise answers about what needs to change there. I think there's no doubt what's being said. I've got a question here from a nutritional therapist who's got a strong background in cancer biology. She works here in the UK. Her name's Sylvia Grisendi, and she sent in her question as a recording. So I'm just going to play it now and maybe have a little listen to this.
Hi, Robin. This is Sylvia Grisendi. Hello to you, and hello to all your amazing guests. Just very briefly about me, I started a long time ago as a cancer research scientist, and I have subsequently become a nutritional therapist and functional medicine practitioner here in the UK. And for the last 10 years or so, I have been working with people who live with cancer using nutritional and lifestyle medicine. And coming to my question for the panel, obviously we all dream about a near future in which integrative oncology will be the standard of care. Right now, at least in the UK, but in many other countries too, I think, this is not so, or even a consideration sometimes for a lot of people. So, in an ideal world, assuming there were no limits to what kind of treatments, therapies, tests, etc., are accessible to any person who is newly diagnosed with cancer, what would be, in your opinion, the first few fundamental therapeutic strategies that every person who is newly diagnosed should be offered as a standard of care as they start their recovery process from an integrative oncology standpoint? Obviously, assuming that any strategy will be implemented on a personalized basis. Thank you all for your time, and thank you also for the wonderful work that you do. Bye.
Okay. Patria, do you want to weigh in on that one?
Yeah, I'm very happy to, because in many ways it's related to that first question. The fact is we've got a sick system, and what epigenetics has told us is that we need to be aware of what's in the epigenetic environment, which is about sleep and exercise and nutrition, the chemistry of our emotions, the chemicals that are in the environment. And so epigenetics tells us that we have to start treating people, not treating diseases. And the whole system became so corrupted, we all fell in love with the idea of a silver bullet because of antibiotics, and we've been expecting a silver bullet that we could live whatever lifestyle we like. There'll always be a silver bullet that will get rid of any problems. And of course, we know that that's completely incorrect. And perhaps in oncology, more than in any other field, there's this sense of the ownership of the patient by the system. Indeed, to the fact that if you disagree with treatment for a child of 12, the child is made a ward of the state, rather than having the parent have care and control of the child. So obviously the oncologist is only focused on the treatment. And what the oncologist needs to say is that there's a great deal more to healing from cancer than just chemotherapy, radiotherapy, surgery. And we really need you to focus on exercise and nutrition and dealing with stress and what's going on in your life, we have to listen to their stories because, everyone's got a story and you can't treat a disease. You have to treat a person. So give the patient lots of things to do that empowers them, that gives them hope that I can make a difference in this situation so that they can actively engage with the healing that they're involved in, rather than just expecting a silver bullet. You don't need to do anything. We're going to fix you. And we know that that simply just doesn't work. People are dying in droves after the war on cancer. So, and now, particularly since recent times, we have many, many people being diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. And this is just in the last year or so. And it's a very, very serious problem that's growing dramatically as we speak.
I'd love to hear Ian speak on this subject. An old friend and colleague, done beautiful work on this. Ian, what are your reflections on it?
Well, thanks, Michael. Sylvia asked about therapeutic opportunities at first diagnosis, and I think from the patient's perspective, from the person's perspective, there's a couple of key questions, and I always start with one that often surprises people a bit, and I ask them, do they actually want to live or not? Because for a lot of people, I think cancer comes at a time in their life when their lives are actually really quite difficult. And an old colleague and mentor of mine who was a psychiatrist felt that for many people, cancer was a socially acceptable form of suicide. And that's a pretty strong statement to make, and it sort of can confront people a bit. And I've never met anybody who consciously set out to give themselves cancer and die of it. But this element of, how much do you want to live is an important starting point. And given that people do want to live, then I think the next question is, who's going to be responsible for my healing and the decisions around it? So do I actually look to other people, which might be from the family, from friends, from doctors, from natural therapists, and basically ask them for their best advice and do what I'm told? Or do I seek that advice but actually retain responsibility for my own choices? And I guess the majority of people I've worked with over the decades have been people who will have choice. And so then it's like, well, particularly these days, anybody who gets on the net and looks at what can I do if I'm diagnosed with cancer takes about, 5-10 minutes to feel overwhelmed. Mm-hmm. I started running groups in 1981, and our organisation was a source of information. People came to us thinking there was nothing they could do and looking for us for possibilities. And just the fact that there were possibilities was transformative, because it took them from feeling hopeless with no possibilities to realising there was a lot they could do for themselves. And that shift in hope was dramatic in the impact it had on both their physical health and their mental state, and even their spiritual well-being. When people take the initiative and are clear that they want to be the one who decides, then clearly, the most important thing is the mind. Because we can talk about things like diet and exercise and medical treatment and natural therapies and all these sorts of things. But it's actually the mind that decides whether you do stuff or not, and it's the mind that decides how committed you are and how much you follow through, how much you persevere. And so that's why in an ideal world, I always recommend to people to start a meditation practice as soon as they possibly can, because through meditation there's a very reliable and direct means of finding some inner peace and calm. And when people are first diagnosed with treatment and trying to work out the options, their mind's often quite the opposite. It's freaked out, to put it bluntly. They can feel confused, can be emotionally distraught. It's very hard to think clearly and calmly. And so to provide somebody with a direct means to actually settle their mind and to give them the potential to use their most powerful asset to its best and to be able to make good choices and follow them through, I think that's why I think meditation's the actual practical starting point, because then that leads on to everything else.
Okay. So
I would like to, can I weigh in on this just a little bit about what can doctors do? And one of the very important components of both, it's a convergence of conventional with complementary medicine, is immunotherapy. So the idea that the immune system has the power to overcome the cancer and that there's a struggle going on between the cancer and the immune system, it's a very old idea. And, it goes back and if you want to say it goes back to the ancient times, but in modern scientific development, it was noticed in the mid-19th century that people who got particular kind of infection sometimes had a spontaneous regression or resolution of their cancer. And this is associated with the name of William B. Coley, who was a bone surgeon at Memorial Sloan Kettering, and starting in the 1890s, started to give a streptococcal microorganism. It was derived from a skin disease called erysipelas, and we inject cancer patients with that and got remissions of the cancer. And in the early days of his practice, he had a conventional practice as a bone surgeon, head of the department of bone surgery at Memorial, but also had a private practice giving people a mixed bacterial vaccine. And we know a tremendous amount about the outcomes of these patients. It wasn't a clinical trial because the modern clinical trial wasn't invented until the 1930s and 1940s. But in the early phase of his career, from about 1893 to about 1911 or so, he had a very effective vaccine, and many people at different stages of cancer were put in remission. I used to do a lot of radio shows, and I was on Bob Atkins' show and many other shows around the country. And twice I had the experience of having people, they were call-in shows, and I had twice had the experience of people calling in and saying that they had been treated for cancer and had been cured of cancer back in,
wow,
back in the day, before World War I. They were kids, with bone cancers, and then they grew up and they were old people in the 70s and the 80s. And one time this person just said, well, I went to New York and I was cured of my cancer. I said, well, you must have been treated by William B. Coley. And they were like, how do you know that? Right. Well, of course, because he's the only one who could have cured you at that time. Yeah. But fast forward a couple of years ago, and Jim Allison of MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston shared the Nobel Prize for discovery of the immune checkpoint inhibitor drug, Yervoy, and that class of drugs. And Jim Allison is the scientific director of the foundation founded by William B. Coley's daughter, Helen Coley Nautz, and is that one of the leading immunotherapists in the world. So there is a direct link between Coley's work and the work what's now conventional medicine for several different kinds of cancer, like melanoma in some forms of lung cancer, and increasing list of cancers. The key thing, though, and this is something that everybody should be aware of, but very few people are, and that is that small doses of these drugs work as well as big doses. And the reason, in my opinion, the reason that they don't promote this work, and there have been at least 4 studies showing that there is no dose response curve in the use of these drugs. In other words, it's more like an on-off switch. The reason they don't is because the drug company gets paid by the milligram or the milliliter of the drug that they sell. It's entirely profit based on the amount that they can push onto people. And so there's no, these drugs make billions of dollars. I think Keytruda made over $20 billion last year. That's one of these drugs. So there's no profit in it for them to cut the dose 3 or 4-fold. It's quite the opposite. It's like saying, hey, you made $20 billion. How does $5 billion sound? Or maybe $1 billion.
Hey, Ralph, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Because you're sort of really into this stuff. What you're saying, I think is probably reasonably general knowledge. I would have thought it's why aren't the administrators intervening here? Why if the drug companies are pushing so hard, you can understand that, and they've obviously got a financial imperative. But why are our administrators failing on their side and allowing Big Pharma to take over cancer medicine in the way that they have?
Because because bribery and corruption of leading oncologists is not illegal.
But don't you think, I meet a lot of oncologists and I meet a lot of administrators, and there's some very good people there, and there are lots of people who are interested in exposing corruption. Do you think it's just overwhelming? And what do you think about the potential for the future in this?
Well, Ian, it's a whole system. It isn't one thing. It's that, first of all, if you or I were an oncologist, it's very hard to change the system. And if you go up against it, you are basically going to spend your life doing that and probably not be successful. That's all I could say. So it is going to take either some governmental, shakeup, or it's going to take some brave individual. Like we have somebody in the U.S., Vinay Prasad, who has similar views to my own, and he's an oncologist, University of California, San Francisco, and he's written a book and he's written articles. So there is some motion around this, but how far do you get if you are functioning within the system? How far do you get if you attack the people up above you and accuse them of being corrupt?
Well, it seems to me that this is a key issue for integrative oncology. Yeah. And in the past, like more than 10 years ago, it was actually the patient groups who were actually leading the way on this. It was the patients were giving voice to what they really needed. And yet, from what I can tell, it seems to me that the patient groups themselves have become big businesses, and they've been influenced by big business. And they've become part of this system.
They were penetrated by pharma, and some of them were bought off. And some of them, I had personal experience with this, that sometimes they were set up, that it's what's called astroturf. In other words, instead of grassroots, it's a synthetic grassroots movement created by the drug company to promote the rights of the patient, which means that if the FDA occasionally, Food and Drug Administration, does the right thing and doesn't want to approve or continue approving a drug that doesn't work, and next thing they know, there are picket lines around FDA headquarters of patients who either are bought and paid by the drug company or else are duped by the people who are bought and paid by the drug company. So it's complicated. The cost is what's going to bring this thing down is the greed of the drug companies, meaning that if it costs $1 million to treat patients with this immunotherapy, which is now what it costs for receiving two drugs, Yervoy and Opdivo or Yervoy and Keytruda, it comes to, by the time you're done, it's like $1 million a patient, which means, as the New York Times had an article the other day, that a lot of people just can't afford these modern medications that are supposedly miraculous. But there's actually, a way out of this, and that is that with the immunotherapy, you can lower the dose and simultaneously increase the immune potency, immune potential of the patient. Because the other thing we know, with very good research at MD Anderson, is that the biggest predictor of survival with immunotherapy is the innate strength of the immune system, which is measurable in terms of the number of lymphocytes the person has. So if you have something in hand that can boost the immune system, meaning primarily, or at least measured by the number of lymphocytes, you can then greatly increase the survival time and the likelihood of long-term remission of the patient. So you work on it on both ends. Lower the dose so that these horrible side effects that are associated with modern-day conventional immunotherapy become much less drastic, and you boost the immune system so that you can take advantage of the immune modulating drugs. But of course, the conflict here is, what's the biggest thing that brings down the immune system? It's chemotherapy and everything else. And I certainly agree about the role of the mind in this, because there's a correlation too between your mental mood, your emotional state, your mental state, and the state of your immune system. They're one and the same, really.
Thank you.
UK Health Radio, the station that makes you feel good. UK Health Radio, the station that makes you feel good.
I've got another recording of a question here, so I'm going to play that.
I'm Dr. Rafi Abdelhadi. I am a clinical oncologist and a functional medicine doctor. My question for the wonderful panel is very simple. I'm not going to ask about nutrigenomics or optimizing vitamin D or special diet or microbiome diversity. I just need to ask, based on your vast experience, what is the most single affordable modification or change that you do for your patients in order to make them feel that they are on the right track, that they have hope to continue on this path? Because healing doesn't happen overnight, and cancer didn't happen overnight. So what is your best advice when a cancer patient comes to you? Thank you very much.
Patria, do you want to...
I think one of the most important things, well, in fact, the most important thing is peace of mind. And I think to say to a person, don't drink your juice and meditate and forgive everyone and eat a fabulous diet so you won't die. By all means, drink your juice, eat a fabulous diet, meditate, forgive everyone so you live today well, so that the emphasis is on living. And basically, we have these two systems in the brain, the default mode network, which is all our past experience, the I'll be happy when story, but we have the task positive network, which is our neocortex. That's the bridge to our spirit. So when we connect people with their task positive network, their executive functioning brain, then we have access to the qualities of our first nature rather than what's become second nature to us. Because people say all the time, it's second nature for me to feel like this, think like this, react like this. No one ever questions, well, what's your first nature? But when we teach people to meditate, to harness their attention, and operate through the task positive network, then you have access to insight, intuition, wisdom, humor, spontaneity, creativity, compassion. These are the qualities that lead you in the direction of healing. And so for most people, look, in the beginning, most people are in shock for the first 6 to 8 weeks, a little bit, discombobulated by the whole thing. But we can absolutely, and not also, our presence is the most important therapeutic tool in that first interview. If you turn up 100% and are deeply present to another human being, and you have your task positive network engaged, which questions to ask, that listening is far more important than talking, that you can help this person to know themselves and to make choices that resonate with who they are. Because if it doesn't mean something to them, then they're just doing it for somebody else. It has to engage the person. They have to feel that they have the opportunity to make choices around what they eat, when they go to bed, how they go to bed, how they switch their mind off. All of these very, very practical things that only are the surface of integrative oncology, but helping people to sleep, to eat, because if you've had your stomach removed, then you're not going to be able to eat the diet that you ate before. So we have to tailor everything to the individual. That's why our presence, for me, is incredibly important, because if our mind is not still, we won't know those skillful questions to ask a patient to help them to understand and know themselves in their own depths.
Thanks very much, Petrea. Dr. Block, what's your best advice when a cancer patient comes to you?
Well, Robin, I would actually say, simply that emotional support, encouragement, and providing an environment that is life-affirming, a communication that deeply acknowledges and provides hope. But you have to really, truly believe it. People can see right through it when it's not authentic. And I would say that it means one has to provide real tools, real therapies, substance behind the communication in order to really make a difference. Keeping that in mind, I would say cancer itself is a marathon. And it's far from a wind sprint, even though that's what all of us, if we get a diagnosis of any life-threatening disease, but certainly particularly malignancy, this isn't going away just because necessarily scans clear. I often say that cancer's the invisible aspects of the disease are probably worse than the visible aspects of the disease. And I mean that in multiple layers, but the most obvious one is that these are microcellular diseases. They're molecular diseases. They're diseases of energy and pathways and metabolism as much as they are of tissue and replication and abnormal cellular biology. And certainly they're considerably beyond mutation, even though we most would agree that mutagenic biology is as fundamental to a cancer. But it's also the idea of a damage to DNA on its own is not the whole story. And we know that this is modifiable. It's something that can be adjusted, modulated, changed by how we take care of ourselves. So the way that I would kind of frame this, because the issue of affordable, comes to mind, is that one thing that has been relatively ignored throughout medicine for the last at least several hundred years, with some exceptions and pockets here and there, is that it's not only about DNA and the cell. it's also about the environment that the disease exists within. And that environment, which you might call the microenvironment, back in the 70s as a medical student, I called that environment the terrain. And the terrain is made up of a variety of biochemical, immune, metabolic factors and pathways that, if disrupted, drives disease, interferes with treatment, drives adverse effects, interferes with quality of life. It has a profound impact, and yet we can measure it relatively easily with a whole wide footprint of various laboratory testing, and we can modulate it by fixing that environment so it's cancer inhibiting and not just cancer promoting, keeping in mind that the cells will hijack your biology to support themselves. So we have to get a hold of the soup, the soil that these seeds, these abnormal seeds are growing in, and we got to transform that environment. That is not costly to do. It's time-consuming. It requires a commitment because it is impacted by every aspect of how we take care of ourselves, how we live, how we eat, how we sleep or not, what our relationships are and the impact on us in terms of sympathetic nervous system and adrenergic biology, how we attend to our own parasympathetic needs in terms of whether it's meditation, prayer, music, and even optimism or the lack thereof, and what its consequential impact is on us. So I would say that extracellular environment is a biggie. To answer your question, for me, that terrain needs to be fixed. And without sounding self-serving, my book, Life Over Cancer, I spent 7 chapters in that book discussing the importance of the terrain and substantiating all the science behind it. And keep in mind that I spent a good part of the 70s, 80s, and 90s doing research to demonstrate that that microenvironment is real, is critical to what happens to a patient. Just as important as the cell is the extracellular environment with it. And optimizing one's terrain, it can be fixed. So it is cancer fighting. It can be fixed. So you basically can reduce treatment toxicities. You can boost treatment efficacy. You can reduce resistance from developing. And yes, you can boost outcome. So virtually all of the challenges that we face are interwoven with getting that environment optimized.
Thanks very much. So maybe we'll go to something a little bit controversial at this point now. So I've got a question here. This is going to be right up Ralph's street, I think. It comes from Dawn Waldron, who's a nutritional therapist specializing in supporting people with breast cancer. Indeed, she's an ex-breast cancer patient herself. And she asked, as our knowledge of epigenetics and nutrigenomics expands, it becomes increasingly clear that the DNA damage inflicted by some conventional treatments has the potential to significantly accelerate growth and repair pathways in ways that may be undesirable in people with active cancer. While my practice currently focuses on helping clients make the most of integrative care, I find myself wondering if our evolving understanding of cancer behavior has arrived at a point where chemotherapy in particular may be considered to harm more people than it helps. Can we honestly justify its continued use? So, Ralph, I think you're the man to start this one off.
I wrote a book called Questioning Chemotherapy a long time ago, 25, 30 years ago. So I don't think, facts don't lie. And because there is so much resentment and hatred, I would say, of chemotherapy, understandably, it's important to emphasize that there are situations where it is necessary, where it does work, we don't have a substitute for it right now. And of course, I'm thinking of the acute lymphocytic leukemia cases. There's some of the other pediatric cancers. And then the other thing is that just statistically, chemotherapy in the higher risk breast cancer and colon cancer cases does seem to extend survival. So I don't think we're ready to get rid of it right now. I mean, quite yet. Let's put it that way. I do think that eventually it's going to be looked upon as sort of the way we look on the use of mercury and opium and bloodletting in the future. But we're not at that point yet. Okay, so I can't say that it has even conceptually has no uses. But for the advanced stages of cancer, that's stages 3 and especially stage 4 of the solid tumors of adults. Yuri Abel was a biostatistician at University of Heidelberg. Did a little book about 30 years ago, chemotherapy for advanced epithelial cancers. That was the inspiration for my book, Questioning Chemotherapy, and basically showed that chemotherapy had very little impact. And I think there have been many studies since then, since my book came out, confirming that the percentages are small. Even I mentioned earlier Jim Allison at University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center, in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, said, for most advanced cancers, if we can move the needle over by a couple of months, we're doing really, really well. So I think it's more or less a proven thing. Chemotherapy has really moved into the rear guard in terms of the drug industry. I think I saw some statistics the other day that of the drugs in the pipeline, only about a quarter of them are even chemotherapy, and the rest of them are targeted therapies and immunotherapies. So it's had its day, but we have to be able to show that we have methods that are as good, if not better, and but the battle really now is more over the question of the targeted drugs and the immunotherapy drugs.
Thank you. Michael, do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, I do. I think Ralph's work on this has been really important and very substantive. I'd like to point out, Ralph mentioned V.K. Prasad's book, Malignant, which is one of the important books questioning conventional therapies. But I'd like to add that, as Ralph well knows, there's a whole history of these. So, for example, when I was writing Choices in Healing over 25 years ago, there was a man named John Cairns who did a piece for Scientific American on the limits of conventional therapies. And he had been really well respected up until he wrote this piece. Then he got just an immense amount of abuse about it. He wrote one more piece, got more abuse, and after that, he just went back to other subjects. Then there's a guy named Clifton Leaf, who wrote a very important book called The Truth in Small Doses, which tells the story of what happens to John Cairns and others. And, that was given to me by a leading person in cancer oncology who thought very highly of Clifton Leaf. Then there is V.K. Prasad's recent book called Malignant, which is excellent. But also Aza Raza has written a book called The First Cell. And she's a professor of oncology at Columbia. And her husband died of the cancer that she was treating. I think it was leukemia. And so the point is that if you begin to look, and Ralph Moss has mentioned another book, and also, by the way, in Aza Raza's book, she references hundreds of articles in the oncology literature on this subject. So there is an immense body of literature on the limitations of conventional therapy. And then there's another literature on whole person approaches, which we've been hearing about today. And so I think a place where I have a different emphasis from Ralph, though I don't disagree with him, is that he calls it corruption, which you can call it that. I am inclined to use softer language. It's not that I differ from his characterization, but I simply say that the incentives for oncologists and so forth are such. And similarly to the question that you were asking before, actually that Ian Gawler was asking about, why the government doesn't step in. The polite answer to that isn't corruption. It's called, quote, agency capture, end quote. And so what agency capture means, you could call it corruption, is that there's a revolving door between the agencies that are supposed to, decide these things and the drug companies. People move back and forth among them as a career decision. So it depends on who you're addressing as to whether the corruption language is more useful, it's straightforward and accurate, or whether you're talking into the mainstream, in which case there is milder language that makes the same point. And that's why I just want to come back to the fact that we are at a point where whole person cancer care, with more emphasis on health promoting activities and reduction of the use of conventional therapies that only extend life by 2 or 3 months, and it's often miserable months. They bankrupt families and they bankrupt the entire system. We're really at a point where it's rational, profoundly rational, to make this the standard of care.
Keith, I imagine you've got quite a bit to say about this.
It's actually a fabulous question. It's a very complex question because as chemotherapy is more often than not utilized, I would embrace the question as a legitimate question because of the level of toxicity, the limited use as a single tool. In context of the multi-layered system that we understand today, it would be hard for me to believe that any 1 or 2 or even 3 bullets would be enough to hit the 50 or 500 bullseyes that make up the biology that's driving malignancy. And our medical model has been fixated for way too long, specifically in this idea that we're going to find a magic bullet, a silver bullet, that's going to knock down just the right bullseye and everything else is going to follow. The only exception to what I'm talking about is immunotherapy and some of the newer drugs and newer approaches with regards to immune treatments can have a multi-targeted impact. Even though it might be one drug that's given, it's working with multiple arms of the immune system that can have a rather profound effect. But the problem here is that so far it works in amazing ways, but only in a very few small number of patients. Now, I would argue that this speaks even more aggressively to integrative care because we know from a number of randomized controlled trials, gold standard research, that if we get the microbiome diverse, if we get those bacteria having dozens and dozens and dozens of cousins, that diversity will drive up the effectiveness of immunotherapy markedly. If we get rid of agents and strategies that actually narrow our diversity of our microbiome, it does just the opposite. And we need, if we don't get rid of them, if we get rid of them, we enhance. Examples of that are tricky because sometimes it's life-threatening sepsis or pneumonia or some infection that has to be treated with an antibiotic. But we know that antibiotics, as well as probiotics, not prebiotics, as well as probiotics, narrow diversity. Fermented foods, high-fiber diets, healthy diets, cashews, Jerusalem artichokes, for reasons that we don't fully grasp and understand, drive up favorably diversity. So there's things that we can do to really kind of influence this, from the perspective that you asked the question. Additionally, and maybe from my perspective, much more importantly, I think the real question about chemotherapy may be solely the way it's currently given. That said, science first shows, most importantly, that incomplete chemotherapy reduces survival. So if you get significant side effects, the classic thing we doctors do is drop dosing or delay treatment or widen the interval between treatments, all of which diminishes outcome, shrinks survival. Well documented in multiple studies. There's, a breast cancer study that was done several years ago, almost 500 patients with early stage breast cancer. And of those patients, where they received 25 to 30% fewer treatments because of quality of life and toxicity from adverse effects, those patients they were unable to complete their treatments, or they delayed it, they had shorter survival. It was rather pronounced. And I would argue that it's a no-brainer. Integrative treatment approaches improve quality of life. They reduce toxicity. They allow patients to complete full courses of treatment. And the data speaks for itself that it improves outcome and survival. So what we know and what the research shows is that anything that leads to the need to reduce treatment dosing, anything that leads to a delay in the interval between treatments, interrupted treatment schedules, or anything that leads to a patient abandoning mainstream treatment leads to shorter survival and worse outcomes. So I'm going to go in a little bit different direction just for a minute, Robin, if you can give me a little couple more minutes here. Since opening our doors in 1980, we've been looking for research-based strategies that can help reduce toxicity, reduce treatment resistance, improve quality of life, improve survival. A patient with greater integrity, health integrity, whether that's nutrition, fitness, circadian health, sleep, biobehavioral care, all of the different factors that make us up. The patient who has better integrity does better. There's no surgeon on the planet that would have an argument with having a healthier patient on the table. Why should that be any different for anybody practicing medical oncology, radiation oncology, surgical oncology? Doesn't make any difference at all, or integrative oncology. So in the 90s, I come across a pioneer in the field, Dr. William Reshevsky, who actually had the original idea of what today we would call chronotherapy or chronomodulated chemotherapy, time-sensitive drugs. Chrono means time-sensitive. Every drug has a window on a 24-hour clock that I would call the happy hour. It's when the drug is the most effective and the least toxic. It's significant enough that in some cancers, you can get as much as a 400% improvement in 5-year survivals based on existing randomized controlled research. that is a huge statement because so many of our drugs get licensed for sometimes as little as weeks, most often months. And so many of our drugs really have a very small percentage impact in a long, a large set of research that has been looking at trying to make better drugs and get better outcomes. So the importance of timing is essential because it speaks to reducing toxicity. If you implement drugs when the healthy cells are at rest and they're the least vulnerable to chemotherapy, and you implement those drugs also when the cancer cells are the most active and most vulnerable, which turns out to be the same timing in terms of research, you get much, much better outcomes, not just the time of day. Also, on a 24-hour clock, there's a window that I refer to as the happy hour. If I give you the drugs at that window, you get the best results, best response, best outcome, least toxicity. But if I give you exactly those drugs 12 hours earlier or later, you get the most toxicity and the least benefit from the drugs. So, but it's not just the time of day. It's also what we call the style of the infusion. So I'll be a little cute on this one, but think of this as if you drop frogs in boiling water, they jump to save their skin. But if you start with room temperature water and you sneak up on them with heat, by the time they recognize they're being cooked, it's too late. They already are. So now take cancer cells. We know this because of the existing research. And you take these cancer cells, you drop them into a pool of chemotherapy, high concentration. They're not stupid. Like the frogs jumping out of water, they shut their pores, they congregate, and they go to sleep. What we do instead is we start with a tiny trickle of drug. And that actually agitates cells. And when they become agitated, they start gobbling up chemotherapy at 2, 3, 4 times the rate of a normal cell. When I say that, we're talking 100% times the rate. And then we slowly increase the concentration in what's called a sinusoidal wave. You need special technology to be able to give drugs this way. But by doing that, by the time those cells recognize that they're being poisoned, it's too late. They already are, and we can capture far more cells by giving drugs this way. So it's a different model, of care from that perspective. And I would say that the timing, along with nutritional and nutraceutical support, can actually have a profound effect on countering resistance. So drugs work better, work longer, and we get diminished adverse effects, which, as I mentioned earlier, is one of the main reasons patients abandon treatment or their doctors reduce dosing or delay treatment, all of which leads to significantly poorer outcomes. So I would argue that there is a way to give chemotherapy. I would argue it shouldn't be done alone. It should be done in as part of an entire comprehensive system of care. I would, argue that nutritional support, whether it's oral, whether it's dietary, whether it's infusional, in my case, I would say, or all of the above, whether certain off-label drugs can be used and can be enormously helpful, not only for tolerance, but for synergistic value for boosting the effectiveness. But even maybe more importantly, we know that infusional nutrition, I refer to a lot of IV nutrition, not just vitamin C, but a tremendous number of compounds that we use are pleiotropic. These compounds have the ability to multi-target. They grow in nature in a pleiotropic model or manner that allows them to hit not 1, 2, 15, but sometimes hundreds and hundreds of bullets with the same agent, same formulation, and that adds to the therapeutic potential, both because it can enhance the effectiveness of the drug, diminish the toxicity of a drug, and multi-target. I'm saying drug disease. The drugs can enhance the efficacy. The natural products can enhance the efficacy and diminish the toxicity, at the same time. But they also have the capacity to multi-target the disease, the underlying disease itself. One just example, by the way, is that we know, because of multiple randomized trials that were done with lung cancer patients, that these patients will get a platinum based chemotherapy regimen, and in 32 randomized controlled trials, over 2,800 patients, when a platinum is given and a Chinese herbal formula, also European, called astragalus, or a Chinese formula that contains astragalus with it, the research shows a marked decrease in the risk of death, of mortality, and an increase in response and outcome. So it's one of, these kinds of examples that are really very relevant. In addition to that, there's many natural products that we use, to protect the heart from HER2 type drugs, these HER2 new inhibitors like Herceptin and Perjeta and Lapatinib and others. These drugs could cause cardiac damage. We know that the drug adriamycin can have damaging consequences to the heart muscle. But we can give agents like Hawthorne, like coenzyme Q10, a number of antioxidant compounds that can protect and even sometimes reverse some of the damage that has occurred with patients from taking those drugs. But I like to use those drugs prophylactically, preventatively, so that we're not chasing the problem after the fact of preventing it up front. But just as I say, we can deal with adverse effects, there's compounds we can give to reduce resistance, so your drugs work better and longer. And there's agents we can use that are synergists, that, like the astragalus example, enhance the effectiveness of drugs. And these are not petri dish examples that I'm giving. These are clinical trials that have been, done to really assess the potential value. But even something like fitness, we have fairly good data to show that keeping patients going through chemotherapy really active can make a big difference in reducing toxicity as well. Even walking 3 to 5 hours per week in breast cancer patients was enough to cut mortality by half. In colon cancer patients, getting upwards of 6 hours a week of walking was enough to cut mortality by 61% and cut recurrence by more than half. So we know that these compounds can have an effect, and these lifestyle alterations, making better dietary choices, can really make a big difference for people as well. So it's, from my perspective, a comprehensive model of care that is essential, and a system that is directed at multi-targeting, but selectively and specifically. I do not believe you can throw the kitchen sink at a patient. I don't think that works, and I've seen enough examples of patients that have come through the door trying to follow alternative, complementary, integrative programs that got themselves into deep trouble by overdoing it in what I would call a non-systematic, non-systemic manner, in ways that actually can be, unfortunately, detrimental rather than therapeutic. But done right, I believe you can get enormous benefits And I would argue that chemotherapy has a place still, and I don't think that that's going to disappear anytime soon.
UK Health Radio, the station that makes you feel good. UK Health Radio, the station that makes you feel good.
Thank you very much.
Can I add one here, Robert?
Ian, yes.
Back in 2004, three senior cancer specialists in Australia did quite a detailed analysis based on investigating the outcome of chemotherapy for 22 most common cancers. And they came up with the percentage that they researched that chemotherapy improved 5-year survival by. And I was really stunned by the figure myself, because I thought in those days it might have been something 10 to 20%. And so I went round and I asked friends and family, and the highest figure I got was 90%, which was from a merchant banker. And most people put it around 30, 40, even up to 50%. And everybody was stunned by the real figure, which was 2.8%. 2.8%. And so the marketing of these drugs and the way they've gone into popular perception is that they're and this is well researched and well validated in the research, they're clearly all oversold and overused. And as part of what's happened, I think, in our culture, is that to discuss this is really quite difficult. And people don't actually really want to have the conversation. The media doesn't want to have the conversation. I think even the patient groups don't want to have the conversation. And if the patient wants to have it, often their family doesn't want to have it. There's a lot of pressure that comes from families on individuals to have these treatments because, they want them to live, and they've got the perception that this thing is going to offer a lot more than they actually do. So one of the challenges, I think, in integrative oncology is to be able to have a rational conversation based on evidence about what the likely outcomes are of particular treatments, but also about what the outcomes are of actually lifestyle changes. So, for example, exercise, we know, actually has got more chance of increasing 5-year survival for a woman with breast cancer than chemotherapy does. But most women, when they go to an oncologist, get encouraged to have particular treatments, and hopefully more are getting encouraged to do the exercise and look at their nutrition and all those other things. But that's the challenge.
Martin, brilliant. Well, hopefully that would happen. I think you're better off in Australia from that point of view. There's more happening in the lifestyle. I
think we might be, actually.
But I remember the reaction to Keith Block when he put exercise machines in his clinic and had people exercising while they were getting chemotherapy, or had them out jogging along Lake Michigan. And even I was shocked, No, because it was like, it's one thing to talk about this, and can you really do that? Well, yes, you can actually. You can actually exercise while you're getting the chemo. So, but it's very complex because I speak here also as a cancer patient myself, because I was diagnosed with a very aggressive prostate cancer 7 or 8 years ago, and you are so susceptible. You are at the most vulnerable point maybe in your adult life. And I mean, my case, I've written about this, and was horrendous what happened to me at an Ivy League affiliated medical, school, medical university. So much so that I wonder whether there was maliciousness involved in the way that I was treated, or whether maybe the doctor in question was reading from the wrong patient records. I don't know, because I was told, I was given a completely false diagnosis and told that my cancer had escaped the capsule and had disseminated through my body, which, as it turned out, was not true. But I basically, and told there was no treatment, no effective treatment. And now here I am 7-8 years later, because I refused to go any further with that department, and I went to New York University Langone, which was my alma mater, and was well treated there with cryoablation, and so here I am, still okay. So there can be good outcomes, but I've been through that mill, and I know what patients go through, and it's from my case, my perspective, it was far worse than I suspected that it would be. It's far worse.
Right.
Plus, you're dealing with a potentially fatal disease, so you have all these Camus, these existential thoughts about life and the meaning of it, or the lack of meaning of it, and so you're dealing with that, and then you're getting the pressure from your family to take the chemo, and of course it's complicated, right? Because there's always going to be something that the public is going to latch on to that gives that hope that maybe there's a way out of this situation. And the medical, I think, Laetrile, which was a non-effective, let's say, treatment that was promoted and highly believed in the 70s. But I think that taught the medical establishment how far they could go if they could convince the public that there were effective treatments for their end stage or advanced cancers. I mean, this is social dynamite, as I would say. It's something very powerful in the human psyche that goes back thousands and thousands and thousands of years to the witch doctors and the priests and the healers and the shamans and so forth. It's just human nature. You're gonna look around and want to find something. This. So it's just normal. And I found myself even in this whole process, 3 a.m, buying stuff on the internet that in the clear light of day, I said, why did I do that? But it's there in the background of your mind. So and then that becomes like the whole thing about quackery, which is kind of baked in the cake in terms of conventional medical education, is that if you promote something outside the realm of so-called scientific medicine, well, you're the lowest of the low. You're a quack, and nothing could be worse than that, right? Somebody who exploits this fear and this angst of, this tremendous need, instead of going with what's scientifically proven. But we've seen that the way in which these conventional treatments are promoted, even though the doctors are cautious in their statements usually, but there's sort of a wink-wink situation going on, because the way it finally reaches the tabloid or the supermarket tabloid is miraculous cure has been discovered for cancer. And one case could be it could be a great case, but one case then becomes like the proof of the effectiveness of this. And you don't see the broad picture like with the immunotherapy. You don't see, the enormous number of people being harmed by the side effects of these treatments. When you combine at the maximum dose, these two of these drugs, more than 50% of the people are winding up with, grades 3 and 4 and even 5 side effects from the drugs. And that part, that doesn't make it into the headlines. It doesn't make it into the supermarket tabloid or the internet sensation. So it is, it's complicated, but I wouldn't throw chemo out entirely. I think that's why I believe in integrative oncology, because I don't think anybody has the answer. I don't think there is. I don't know whether we ever will have. We have bits and pieces of answers. And I think there are very important components. Nobody has mentioned cancer stem cells, for instance, a very important discovery of the past 10, 15 years. The immunotherapy part. What about the metabolism? What would I do if I knew what I know now and I was entering this field? Well, I would try to understand better and draw people's attention to the link between diabetes, type 2 diabetes, sedentary lifestyle, the way we eat today compared to the way most of us ate when we were kids, or the way our parents and grandparents and ancestors fed themselves. I mean, these lifestyle factors, which in the United States, 48% of the population is now diabetic or pre-diabetic. 48%. And it's probably worse than that. It's certainly worse in people in their 60s and 70s. I mean, it's more like 2/3 of the older population is diabetic or pre-diabetic, which is basically, sliding a slippery slope down towards actual diabetes. This relates to cancer. I'm not saying one causes the other, but there's something going on in the metabolism of the average person, especially the sedentary, middle-class, older person who is combining a bad diet, eating out a lot, eating prepared foods, eating a lot of carbohydrates, getting into the food, drinking a lot of beer and wine, and then sitting around basically watching TV or not really being involved in consistent and vigorous exercise. And if I had to change one thing in my life, in terms of physical, life, that would be I would have paid far more attention to the fact that my own blood glucose numbers were clearly slipping over the year, getting higher and higher. And no, only one doctor who was an integrative doctor bothered to bring this to my attention. And she didn't push the point as strong as I wish she had. But, this is a key component of our ill health. It's why these wealthy societies that we live in are so prone to illnesses, because this is metabolic syndrome. This is cardiovascular disease. It's diabetes. It's many different kinds of cancer. So I think that's the sort of the root cause. If we could change one thing, it would be to change the diet, to emphasize certain foods in the diet, because I do believe certain foods are, I don't want to say magical, but there are some foods that are exceptionally healthful and important and essential. And combine that with these mind-body things, which I think are very, very important, but hard to get a handle on. And I'm still trying, even though I do talk about corruption, but I still feel that part of my audience is still, oncologists, and I'm just trying to shock them, Michael, into recognizing what's going on. And if I were an oncologist, I probably wouldn't use the word corruption, because I'm not, and I'm basically a critical outsider. I feel like, well, who else is going to point out? There's a simple English word for this. If you have good connections with the oncology community, sure, they'll use a different term, talk about agency capture and so forth. But there is something rotten going on, which is the bribery. And again, I'm just going to use very simple words here. The bribery of the leadership of the oncology field, of ASCO, by these drug companies to bring them on board to identify their own interests with the interests of the drug company. How this ends, I don't know, but it's the money issue. With Bernie Sanders now head of the Health and Welfare Committee in the Senate, maybe we're going to see some real shakeups in this regard. But this money issue is probably what's going to, with the greed of the pharmaceutical industry meets the needs of the public for affordable medicine, both affordable to the individual and affordable to the society, to the government, Medicare, and to the insurance companies. These are coming into conflict, more and more. So I think it'll play itself out in that realm. I'd like to build on what Ralph was just saying, which I totally endorse. And I also believe, Ralph, as I said, your plain speaking is a gift to us all. And so it all depends on who we're speaking to. But I want to pose a quandary to you all, which is very real for me. If we start with the Hippocratic Oath, above all, do no harm, all right? And you meet cancer patients who, as well we all know, they're frightened, they're vulnerable, and they believe in conventional medicine. And they do not have a sense of personal agency, and we know that only 1 person in 10 has, an internal locus of control, that they really believe they can change things. And they go to these hallowed cathedral halls of science, believing that this is in their best interest and that the oncologist knows best and so on and so forth. And they just simply want to go in, get the treatment that's been recommended, believe in it, come out the other side, and hopefully do better. That's their hope, their prayer, and their whole belief system. Now, we know about the power of placebo, Ted Kapchuk's work at Harvard. It's very, very clear that placebo is active on behalf of conventional therapies when people believe in them. So the quandary that I face is how delicate it is when you are with a cancer patient as to whether raising doubts about conventional therapies is actually going to help them when they don't have a sense of agency. They believe in what they're going to do. It's hard enough to do it that way. Are we really doing no harm when we suggest to them, meditate, change your diet, exercise, all this stuff, which, number one, they may not believe in, number two, they may not have a sense of agency about, and number three, it's not their dharma, it's not the way they're going to go. Mm-hmm. And so, to me, it seems to me, and I don't have a simple answer to this, that the highest art of all is, as Petra was saying, to listen carefully to the patient as to what they believe in, and then adjust your responses to the best path for them, which may be to trust their oncologist, just go through with it, and then in other cases, ask them, well, did you know, or would you be interested in? So there's this question. I really think that integrative oncology faces a conundrum of how to follow the Hippocratic Oath to do no harm in the face of where actual patients are. And I don't know the answer to that, but it's what I'm thinking about today.
No, you make a very good point.
Yeah, Michael, I've got a suggestion there. And I think it's in the direct interest of the patients and really important for integrative medicine as a specialty. And given that integrative medicine more and more is going to become mainstream and best standard of care, it seems to me there's a really big need and opportunity to intervene before people start treatment. So between diagnosis and treatment, I think there's a real value in having a program where patients are guided to go through all these questions and possibilities that we've been talking about before they start treatment. At the very least, we know that most treatments are tough and they're demanding in all sorts of ways, both physically, psychologically. And so for people to be prepared and be given some tools to help deal with that in a way that's consistent with their own backgrounds and belief systems is really important as well. So if we have a program that can actually guide people through that and give them a chance to both adjust to the diagnosis, but then to actually realise that there is real hope, and the hopes can be based on the evidence of people who've gone through these experiences well, but is also backed up by empowering people with what they can actually do, then they're much more likely to make better informed choices about the treatment, and when they do come to take them on, to embrace them because they've made a conscious choice rather than a sort of a fear-based panicked choice, which is often where people start their treatments. So I think and the evidence is that delaying the start of treatment for almost all situations, sort of an emergency where you need some sort of surgical intervention, the evidence seems to be delaying treatment for a couple of weeks makes no difference to long-term outcomes. So there's a real opportunity there, I think, as a paradigm shift in how treatment's approached, which could be taken on by the patients as their choice and saying to their doctors, well, hang on, I'm really interested in what you're offering, but I need to get my head together, I need to get my act together, I need to take time to sort out how I'm going to approach this. And from integrative medicine saying, look, this is really important. If you want the best outcome, it's like anything, the better prepared you are for what you're going to do, the better it'll work. So then, different oncology groups could come up with their own idea of how that program could be run. But it just seems to me like that could actually solve a lot of this. I spent a lot of time with people coming to our groups after diagnosis, after treatment, and doing this in retrospect. And that's much more complicated. I think if you're thinking about how you could change things significantly for the better, would be to give people time to rest and aside before they start getting help from the outside.
Let me just add quickly that, have a heart attack. If you have a heart attack, you have, cardiac rehab. And so I think I agree with you completely in that prehab before treatment is an ideal place to do exactly what you're suggesting. But I also think there's a psychological space after treatment based on cardiac rehab where it makes all the sense in the world to have oncology cancer rehab. And so if we sandwiched treatment, whatever it is, between prehab and rehab, we could work it at both ends. But I still think that there is a real challenge in doing no harm for the average patient who just wants to go in and do what the doctor says, and how we approach that gently so as not to do harm, I think is a challenge for integrative oncology.
Right. Okay, so we got a question here, an energy therapist and spiritual coach with many years experience working in oncology nutrition. She's called Liz Butler, and she asks, I'm very interested in the power of the spiritual heart to support healing from illness, including cancer, and have found that a practice of accessing spiritual wisdom through the heart is invaluable for my clients as they navigate their way along their healing path. It seems, however, that the contribution spiritual connection can make to physical healing is still underappreciated, even though there is now much attention on the power of the mind to support recovery. So, would you agree? And do you see this situation changing? So, Bertie, why don't you weigh in? That's spot on your territory. Why don't you weigh in and tell us what you think about that? And then anybody else could chime in.
Act like a loving parent. Harvard students were asked, did your parents love you? If they said no, 95% had suffered a major illness by middle age. If they said yes, 24% had. So we need to reparent people. And that's why I saw the power of the group therapy, where you were loved, you were cared about, and there were other people in the room, all of whom had shared your illness. So they were not coming from some other place. There is survivor behavior, and we don't teach that. So always ask your patients, how would you describe what you're experiencing? And then when they come up with the word, tell them to eliminate whatever in their life fits that word. Failure, roadblock, pressure. Eliminate it and watch what happens to their health.
Okay, would anybody else like to weigh in on the whole, the spiritual side, if you like, of healing and how much it plays into somebody's recovery?
Well, it seems to me, Robin, like it's the essence of it, really. If we think about why we're alive and the purpose of our life, meaning of our life, which is what people who are diagnosed with cancer tend to do. Once they get over the shock of the diagnosis, it's often people do become introspective. And I think it's pretty clear that, on a physical, if you think about things on a physical level, many people start a healing journey wanting physical healing. And if they accomplish that, that's wonderful. But it wouldn't feel like enough, I don't think. And so many people then address what's going on emotionally. And to feel like you're emotionally healed would be wonderful. But you see people who have got good emotions and their minds all over the place. So to approach it from a mental point of view, get your mind into good shape comes next. But even with all that, it's like if you've got a spiritual void, then I don't think physical health, emotional health, mental health's enough. It's like what's really at the heart of my life and what's really important. So I think if I look back over the groups that we ran, I think one of the strengths was that there was a strong spirituality running through the program, but it wasn't associated with a particular denomination or religious tradition. But it was one of the criteria by which we selected all our therapists. They had to have a strong commitment to their own spiritual path, and they had to have a willingness to be able to open to the diversity of people's views, whether that be religious or very committed to a particular tradition. And I think in the way, particularly our residential programs unfolded, was that it just naturally led to people going into this sort of introspective examination of what was really important in their lives and whether they could actually reconnect if they weren't already with their spiritual essence. So for many people, I think through the trauma of a cancer diagnosis, it leads to a reconnecting with the spiritual life. And over the years, it just amazes me how many people, when I meet them later on after sort of the worst of this has passed through, or the best, but whichever way, they'll say that actually the cancer diagnosis was the best thing that ever happened to me. And it's amazing how many people say that. And the reason they say that is not because they got well physically, but because the cancer provoked them into thinking about what was important in their life, what they really wanted to connect with, what they really wanted to do with their life. And I think for the majority of those people, how they could actually reconnect with their spiritual essence and live more in tune with their spiritual life than, say, their material life.
Okay, now one last question for you all. This is from Kirsten Chick. Kirsten Chick is a very experienced nutritional therapist working in the Brighton area, and she's sent in this question: do you have a message for integrative medicine practitioners out there that would start, if there's one thing I wish I'd learned right from the start, it's... So, Michael, do you want to weigh in there on that one?
Yes, I'd love to. And first of all, Robin, I want to thank you for bringing all of us together. Petra, Keith Block, Bernie Siegel, who was one of the first people I visited in New Haven when I was starting my research, Ralph Moss, who I've worked with for years, Ian Gawler, who I visited in Australia, and, just benefited so much. So I think you've done something very important, and I'm infinitely grateful to be part of it. I think the first thing I would say to an integrative oncology healer is a very ancient adage, which is physician, heal thyself. And that goes to Ian Galler's point that we really can't take people any further than we've gone ourselves. And so whether we frame that in terms of spiritual work, which is a lovely frame, which I love, or my colleague Rachel Naomi Remen has a different way of framing it, which I think is very ecumenical, which is to ask people, what matters now in your life? What matters now? So what matters now is a question that doesn't presume that the answer will be framed in spiritual terms or psychological terms. And for many people, it will be, I want to watch my grandchildren grow up, or whatever it is. But if people can come to terms with what matters now in their own authentic voices, I really know the number of people I've met. Asa Raza, in her book, The First Cell, talks about her husband, who was absolutely a scientific materialist. And we could have talked to him until the cows came home about spiritual life. It would have meant nothing to him. But he had a deeply existential willingness to face a bleak and tragic reality, which was his path. And talking to him about spirituality would not have helped. So I think that ecumenical questions, like what matters now, enables people to express their direction, whatever it is. In our Healing Circles global work, our whole thing is about listening to each other, trusting that each person has within themselves what they need for healings. Do not advise or fix, and so on and so forth. That dimension of engaging with healing work, healing ourselves, and from that place of whatever self-healing means to us, being extraordinarily open to the infinite variety of ways that people heal, knowing that some people who only want to do conventional therapies and believe in them, knowing when they are on a dharmic path, that is their way, and supporting them in that, and then having the gift to know when we can open them to self-care, to complementary therapies, to spiritual life, to all of the other things that we have to offer, to the kind of work that Ralph Moss has done such extraordinary work on different therapies. So in any case, my message would be, physician, heal thyself, and then pay deep attention to how infinitely nuanced it is and how skillful we must be to do no harm and to support people in what they want to do and what they might be open to.
Thank you very much, Michael. Ralph, if there's one thing I wish I learned right from the start, it's...
Well, I think I answered it already. That I'm a person, I couldn't say that thank God I got cancer, but I sometimes do say to myself, thank God I got diabetes, because it opened up the entire world of metabolism to me. It made me really interested in biochemistry and trying to understand this amazing body that we share, that we all have. I want to say about the spirituality that I'm not a religious person, but I get a religious-like insight from art and music and literature, especially literature. So I think, there are depths of, we all have to confront our own mortality and our demise and so forth. And we draw on the legacy this incredible legacy that was left to us by these truly great people who came before us. I feel that scientifically, having known some great scientific geniuses in my life and learned from their examples and as well as what they taught me, but also just it's such a gift to be able to go back and read the works of the Tolstoys and listen to the Beethovens and so forth. I mean, you as an individual are never going to be able to write great symphony probably, or, compose a great play or an epic, but this has been done for us and we have access to this. And I think this is what I'd love to impart to my own grandchildren. I've tried to do that. I taught Latin to 3 of my grandchildren so that they could read Virgil. And it's something that if I were advising a person who was dying, let's say, or, in that dire situation, and I've spoken to literally thousands of cancer patients over the years, my deepest thought, unless you have a religious belief that will carry you through this process, for a secular person like myself, art and art in the broad sense is a kind of quasi-religion, in the sense that it can bring you to a place where you can be at peace with your own demise. So I think this is how, but I never try to impose this on other people. And if they've got a religious belief that will carry them through, well, more power to them. But, my own training, background, my scientific orientation, all of that does not allow me to think in terms of a psyche that's separate from the body. But on the other hand, I have access to amazing riches that we share. They're at the library, they're in the bookstore, they're on the radio. We have amazing heritage of civilization, and that's how I would advise people to enrich themselves and be able to deal with these blows that life delivers to us.
Thank you very much, Ralph. Ian? Yeah, thanks, Robin. I'm one of those people who use their life experience to help others. I got a very difficult cancer back in the 70s, and when I recovered, I went back to my veterinary profession, but people kept asking me how come I was still alive, and that sort of developed into running a fairly large organisation to help people with the self-help sort of lifestyle-based program that we developed. And so I think it's important for people to understand, if they're working in cancer medicine, particularly in sort of support group settings or in integrative medicine, that it is not essential to have had cancer yourself. It's a help, but it's not a prerequisite. And I certainly work with lots of good therapists and other people who hadn't had cancer. I would say to therapists who are setting out in this field, the best bit of advice I would give, apart from all the obvious things, but something you may not think of particularly, is to surround yourself with the best people possible and ask lots of questions. I think that's the way to success in any field, is to network, go to conferences, do what you can to get in touch with the best people possible and ask lots of questions. So, and from a point of view of a founder who set out from scratch and with no sort of background in this to running a reasonably, I suppose, a middle-sized sort of charity, the two things I would do in retrospect is, one, I would have done some more deliberate management training, and the other one is I would have solved the research problem. We tried very hard to get formal research done on the outcomes of our programs, and we just never were able to really get that happening. I'm talking about back in the 80s into the 90s when this sort of field wasn't attracting much interest at all. We tried very hard and we had some very good people helping us, but we just couldn't get the funding and solve that problem. So I would in retrospect, I regret that we couldn't do that, and I would have done more management training, I think.
Thanks, Ian. Petrea?
If there's one thing I'd known right at the start, is that it's not my job to fix people. It's my job to turn up, be deeply present, have my task-positive network engaged so that I can access insight and all those wonderful qualities that are there to be of assistance to the patient, and that listening is far, far more powerful than talking.
Wonderful. Thanks, Petrea. And Dr. Block?
Well, it's a difficult one because what I would say to them is that heal yourself first before attempting to work with others who are really suffering from illness, and certainly if it's a serious disease like cancer, a life-threatening one, I would find it profoundly important to be in touch with what that experience is so that you can carry it over in the communication and the connection with somebody. I guess it's simple to say something that we all know, but we don't always completely own. And that's listening might be the most profound thing that we do as human beings. But when it comes to healing and healthcare and people who are suffering with serious illnesses, listening on a more profound level is even more important. And yet you find in my profession far too often medical doctors who have learned to shut down and shut off, who are sometimes so lost in their own communications that they forget why they're sitting there, and that people need to be not only heard, but embraced in whatever experience that they're going through. So having entered integrative care because of my own ill health, number one, and because of a loss of 3 relatives between my 8th and 16th birthday, I think I was profoundly already affected in that way. So it's a little bit difficult for me to, answer that question without sounding like, been there, done that, but the truth of the matter is that we can never learn that lesson enough. And particularly those of us who have devoted our lives to others' survival, others' health, others, healing. That's, an ongoing necessity to own that lesson.
Great answer. Thank you very much. Bernie?
Little quote: when you want to learn things, talk to the natives, not the tourists.
That's a great ending point, Bernie. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, look, I think we can wrap it up there. I want to thank you all really most sincerely, not just for making room for today's panel, but also on behalf of myself, everybody at Yes to Life, as well as all those practitioners, activists that are out there striving to push the agenda for integration forward. And lastly, of course, the vast numbers around the world who are now directly benefiting from the unstinting initiatives you've all independently generated through your own dedication, continuous effort throughout your lives. So I'd say we all owe you a great debt for your deeply caring missions on behalf of us all. A big thank you.
Thank you, Robin. It's been extraordinary. I'm so delighted to have been here. It's really a wonderful moment, and thank you for bringing us together.
That's absolutely my pleasure, and it's been so great to talk to you all tonight. So thank you very much, and this will make an amazing program to go out to the world.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity, and really lovely to see some of you familiar faces again and to meet some new ones. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patricia.
Thanks, Robin.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Well,
nice to see you.
lovely to be with you, Michael. Good seeing you in there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. You have a good night. Get some rest. Okay.
That was a truly special occasion, packed with gems of accumulated wisdom. Please be sure to share details with friends and colleagues so as many as possible are able to benefit. Thank you so much for listening today. I'll be back with another regular-sized Yes to Life show next week here on UK Health Radio. Goodbye.